The 4/5 rule, or what some call the 80% rule, is a common way of establishing whether adverse action in a selection decision exists. The 4/5 rule is a guideline generally accepted by the courts and the EEOC for making a primary case of disparate impact by showing that an employment practice results in members of a protected class being treated less favorably by an employment practice than members of a non-protected class. Adverse impact refers to employment practices that appear neutral but have a discriminatory effect on a protected group. Adverse impact may occur in hiring, promotion, training and development, transfer, layoff, and even performance appraisals. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination, in employment and otherwise, based on certain characteristics of an individual that are protected by law, including race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Because of this, legal action can be brought against an employer if its policies or practices have discriminatory effects unless the employer can show it adopted that policy or practice to serve a legitimate business purpose. To establish that an employer has violated Title VII and prove a disparate impact employment discrimination case, a plaintiff must demonstrate that a specific employment policy or practice caused an adverse impact on a protected class of individuals. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Department of Labor, and the courts have adopted a test known as the 4/5 rule to calculate adverse impact. This test compares the rates of selection for lesser represented classes of individuals against the rate at which the most represented group is selected. If the lesser represented group has a selection rate that is less than 4/5 or 80% of the selection rate for the most represented group, this can be used as evidence of discrimination or adverse impact being present. Again, a selection rate for a protected class group which is less than 4/5 or 80% of the rate for the group with the highest rate indicates adverse impact. So we must always ask the question, is the percentage of a lesser represented group equal to at least 80% of the percentage of the most represented group? If yes, no evidence of adverse impact exists. If no, evidence of adverse impact in fact exists. There are 5 steps to determining adverse impact using the 4/5 rule. Number 1, identify the policy or practice at issue. Number 2, calculate the rate of selection for each group. Number 3, note which group has the highest selection rate. Number 4, calculate adverse impact ratios. And number 5, use the test to determine if adverse impact exists. Let's take a look in detail. Number 1, identify the policy or practice at issue. To demonstrate adverse impact, a plaintiff, the employee, must show that a particular policy or practice on the part of the employer results in a certain amount of discrimination towards a protected group. Therefore, your first step should be to identify the selection requirement that is responsible for the differing rates of selection. By way of example, let's use a requirement that a police officer in a particular city must be able to lift 100 pounds to be selected for the job. 2. Calculate the rate of selection for each group. The next step in calculating adverse impact is to establish the selection rates for each group of individuals. This is done for each group by dividing the number of applicants selected for the employment process by the total number of applicants. The selection rates will then be compared in a later step. Returning to our example, let's say 100 men and 100 women applied to be police officers in our hypothetical city. 80 men and 60 women were selected for the position. So the selection rate for men would be 80%, or 80 divided by 100, and the selection rate for women would be 60%, or 60 divided by 100. Step 3. Note which group has the highest selection rate. In this step of the process, we determine which group has the highest rate of selection. The rate will be used as the point of comparison on which determination of adverse impact can be made. In our example, men have the highest selection rate for the police officer position at 80%. Step 4. Calculate adverse impact ratios. Once you have calculated the selection rates and determined the group with the highest rate, the next step is to determine the adverse impact ratio for each group. This is how each group's selection rate compares with the most represented group's rate of selection. This is done by comparing the selection rate for each group against that of the most represented group. In our example, we divide the selection rate for women by the selection rate for men, or 0.6, divided by 0.8, and arrive at an adverse impact ratio for female applicants of 75%. Finally, step 5. Determine if adverse impact exists. Once you have calculated the adverse impact ratios for each group, evaluate each adverse impact ratio using the 4/5 rule. This is the simple part. If the adverse impact ratio for a particular group is less than 80%, according to the 4/5 rule, this can be used as evidence of adverse action. Basically, this means that a member of the less represented group is selected for a position less than 80% of the time a member of the most represented group is selected for the same position. Returning to our example, the impact ratio for female applicants is 75%, which is less than 80%, meaning that the policy of requiring police officers to be able to lift at least 100 pounds seems to have an adverse impact on female applicants. To reinforce our understanding of the 4/5 rule, let's take a look at a different example. So here's another calculation of 4/5. In this scenario, we have 80 white applicants, of which 48 were hired. There were 40 black applicants, 12 of which were hired. The selection rate of white applicants is 48 divided by 80, or 0.6, which is 60%. White applicants are the group with the highest selection rate. The selection rate for black applicants is 12 divided by 40, or 0.3, which is 30%. The impact ratio then is 0.3 divided by 0.6, which equals 0.5, or 50%. The impact ratio of 50% is less than 80%, which is evidence based on the 4/5 rule that adverse impact exists. You can use this table and these simple steps to develop your own analysis of whether adverse impact exists in a disparate impact case.